Hey there, welcome back to the Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Show. And today we are going to talk about intersecting narratives in complex families. So, what this means is that in families, the way that we understand trauma is through like a narrative or the story of what happened. And what we're going to be looking at is how these stories or these narratives intersect between family members, some of the difficulties that can cause, especially in these complex families. So the areas that we're going to be looking at is we're going to look at the intersection of these trauma experiences for family members. We're going to look at the impact of family dynamics, the challenges in validating family members' traumas, and also some intervention strategies for invalidation when that happens in a family. We're also going to look at general differences in trauma experiences and ways to promote family resilience through storytelling. So let's get started with our first area, and that is we're going to look at the intersection of trauma experiences. So basically, there's many ways that trauma experiences can kind of intersect and connect with each other. The first one is the parent-to-child transmission. So basically, this is when there's unresolved trauma that is manifested within the family. And so, like a mother who's experienced neglect may be really overprotective of their child, which leads to a lack of independence for the child. So some of those developmental tasks related to independence and that, especially during teenage years, are likely to be frustrated. Another example would be a father that may have unresolved childhood trauma becomes emotionally unavailable because they're shut down or kind of numbed out. And this impacts the child's ability to form secure attachments. Another area that intersects is siblings, and that is sometimes there's a behavioral influence between siblings when there's unresolved trauma or when there's trauma within the family system. And basically, this may be an example is an older sibling that's witnessed domestic violence that acts out aggressively, and it influenced the other siblings as far as they may either mimic them and become aggressive themselves. They kind of learn by example, or they might fear their sibling, and it may cause difficulties with those connections within the family. So another example would be a sibling who was bullied at school. They become really withdrawn. They kind of shut down. And the younger sibling's sense of safety at school becomes questionable, and they don't feel safe at school, and their social behavior changes as a result. The next area of intersection is multi-generational influences. So this is where you have indirect trauma transmission, or when you have patterns of behavior in a family that are transmitted through just the interactions of the family members. So examples of this would be a grandparent who has been to war, and it leads to their child's strict discipline. And when that child becomes a parent, they are strict as well, which may cause difficulties with the child's sense of safety or self-worth. Another example would be a grandparent who grew up in poverty, causes the parent to have a lot of anxiety about financial stability, and then this impacts the child and creates a high stress environment for the child. The next area is parental relationship dynamics. So this is the relationship between the parents that can intersect and cause some difficulties for the children. So if there's unresolved marital conflict or domestic violence, this leads to the children experiencing fear, anxiety, or even taking sides, having split loyalties. If the parent has some substance abuse difficulties and it affects the family environment, this may lead to neglect, emotional neglect of a child, or even emotional instability. Another area is family role dynamics. So these are the roles that people take in a family to kind of create some kind of stability, even if it's not very functional. So one of the main family role dynamics is caretaking, or what we would call a parentified child. So this is when a child becomes a caretaker for a parent that may have mental health, substance abuse, all those kinds of concerns. And this impacts the child's own emotional development, impacts their academic performance, has huge impacts on them. The other caretaking role that may be present is when a sibling assumes a parental role for the other children in the family, because the parent is absent or they're not able to do the parenting effectively. So this leads to a lot of resentment between siblings, can lead to burnout. Can become a disorganized attachment strategy that becomes dominant and creates lots of trouble in relationships. Our next one is the extended family influence. So this might be like cultural or societal trauma where the extended family has experienced difficult things and it impacts the current generation of children. So examples would be when extended family members have experienced significant racism or discrimination, this impacts the family's sense of collective identity or safety, which can have huge ramifications for the kids in many different areas. Another one would be cultural trauma, like forced migration, refugee status, all those kinds of things that are very significant, that they create differences in the family narratives. They have to create a way to understand that. And it can create certain behaviors that are impactful to the current generations. And then these impact each member's trauma responses. So that's a really important one with everything we have going on in the world right now. There's also, the last one is environmental or community trauma. So this is where you may have neighborhood violence or disaster strike, something that happens on kind of a social or societal level or to the whole community. So this examples would be family members that experience community violence, maybe violent crime, disasters. They can have very compounded trauma responses, and that influences family dynamics. There can be poverty or socioeconomic hardships in a community that leads to collective stress, causes difficulties for family members differently based on their roles and ages. It's going to impact a grandparent and a parent much differently than it impacts a child. It'll impact children and teens very differently as well. Second area we're going to look at is the impact of family dynamics on the intersection of trauma. So first, we need to understand what family dynamics are. So they're basically the roles, communication patterns, and hierarchies within the family that influence their individual behaviors and their emotional responses. So these family dynamics have a significant impact on the trauma experience. First of all, there is the hierarchical family structure. So if there's a family with a very strict hierarchy, trauma may be experienced very differently at those different levels of that hierarchy. So a child may feel very powerless, while a parent may feel totally overwhelming responsibility. An example of this would be like a military family has high expectations, rigid discipline, can lead to children feeling anxious and pressured to perform. Second area is egalitarian family structures where people are pretty much equal or on the same level. So they may share trauma more openly. They may have open discussions with each member having a voice in that process. And this can lead to better collective coping, or it can be traumatizing or re-traumatizing for the children. And it can have difficulties with taking responsibility, or it may cause confusion between roles and lead to some of that parentification at times. So an example may be a family that encourages open dialogue. They might deal with trauma by discussing feelings and supporting each other, which can either heal or overwhelm other family members with those shared traumas and burdens. So the expression of trauma is also really important. You can have open communication versus suppression, which families who openly communicate are more likely to express their trauma openly. They may have mutual support, but it can be re-traumatizing if it's not managed appropriately. So families that suppress emotions may not talk about their trauma, which leads to a lot of internalized stress for members and can further lead to physical illness or mental health difficulties. So, an example of this is a family where emotions are openly expressed. A child may feel supported, but relive trauma because there's constant discussions about it. So, a contrast to that would be a family where emotions are suppressed, nobody's talking about it, and trauma may manifest as physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, body pains, autoimmune difficulties, or even behavioral issues. We also want to look at conflict resolution styles, which families that resolve conflicts constructively tend to have family members who express trauma in a healthy way and seek support. Families with destructive conflict resolution styles may make trauma worse, and family members may feel isolated or invalidated as well. So, an example of this is a family that handles conflicts with shouting or violence. So family members may express trauma through withdrawal or through anger. And the opposite of that would be if a family that discusses things calmly and openly, members might feel safer to express their trauma and seek help. Our third area that we're going to look at is challenges in validating trauma. So, validation is really important because it helps build healing and trust within the family. It's listening and learning from one's trauma experience and recognizing that as their experience without trying to change it, shift it, make it better, or deny it. So there's some significant challenges in validating other people's trauma narratives. First can be conflicting memories and perspectives. People may not experience the trauma from the same angle or in the same way, which can create conflict between what people remember. So they may have totally different perspectives of the exact same event. So siblings may recall an incident of parental abuse very differently, and with one that minimizes the violent event and the other one having significant distress from it. The second area is emotional reactions and defense mechanisms. So family members may have really strong emotional reactions or defense mechanisms to defend against those emotional reactions and the trauma that really hinder validation. So that may be where a parent downplays or denies the impact of the trauma on the child in order to avoid guilt or shame or anything like that. The third is significant generational gaps. So differences in generational viewpoints can be a barrier to validation. It may be hard for an older generation to understand the significant impact on a younger person or vice versa. So an example of this may be that older generations tell you to tough it out mentality, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, just move on. While younger generations want a lot of emotional validation, expression, and support. And our fourth area is cultural and societal influences. Cultural norms and societal influences can really impact how trauma is perceived and validated. Some cultures openly discuss it, and some people or cultures, when you openly discuss things that are private, it leads to stigmatization and more invalidation. So it's really important to understand those cultural and societal influences as well. So what do we do to intervene and support families, or what are some strategies that families can use? So we're going to look at intervention strategies for invalidation. So we first need to understand common forms of invalidation, which are minimization, which downplays the impact of the trauma. So it may be, that wasn't that bad, you'll get over it, don't worry about it. The next is denial. So it may be just refusing to acknowledge that it occurred. So it's just denying that something that didn't happen. What are you even talking about? And the last one is blame, that they hold the person who has experienced the trauma responsible for their experiences. So they may say, well, you brought this on yourself, you're going to have to deal with it. So those are all common forms of invalidation when we're talking about trauma. So strategies mainly for therapists to address invalidation is first to encourage active listening and empathy or compassion training. So teaching family members to actively listen and empathically listen to each other. And this may be a skill that they never learned in their own family. So it's really important if they don't have, it's a skill deficit. So if they don't have the skill, we want to teach them how to listen actively and be empathic or compassionate toward each other. So this may include reflective listening, where you just reflect back what the person has said, or it may be validating feelings and acknowledging others' emotions without judgment. We want to create a safe space for open dialogue. So we want family members to be able to talk openly in a safe way. So you want to have ground rules for communication and respect during any kind of family session. I think that kind of is standard in family interventions, but in this case, it's really important to make that very clear and explicitly talk about it and have a discussion or a kind of a group standard or understanding or norm that you want to have in family groups when we're working with trauma. So you definitely want to set boundaries on the discussion in the group. So there shouldn't be no interrupting, no judgment, and ensuring everyone has a chance to speak. So not one person doesn't kind of monopolize the time and draw all the attention away from all the other family members. And also having a safe word where if somebody feels significantly dysregulated or invalidated or feels very upset, there may be a designated word that family members can say in order to slow the process down or stop it and recalibrate before starting again. Psychoeducation is also really important because it can really impact invalidation and help support people to learn how it affects people and how to do it, how to validate somebody's emotions and feelings. So we want to educate family members on how invalidation affects mental health and relationships. Invalidation is really tied into a lot of mental health, anxiety, depression, self-harm. So it's really important that we address this, particularly with families with significant or intergenerational trauma. So you may want to provide examples of invalidation and how the consequences are for a certain family member, and certainly discussing that the psychological impact of invalidation when someone feels unheard and unsupported. Could also role play or model validation. So this would be really important if those skills aren't there. So you could do scenario-based practice where you kind of role play through a situation where they act out common invalidating scenarios or interactions, and then they reenact them or they shift and change them using more validation ways to communicate and support other people. And the therapist obviously should be modeling, demonstrating how to respond compassionately and supportively. This becomes very difficult when you've got intersecting narratives where one person has hurt another person. And when you're supporting one person or when you're supporting the person that caused the harm, it may feel very invalidating to the person who is harmed. So it's very important to very clearly discuss how you may be multi-partial or may not, you're not going to be taking sides between family members, but each family member's input and experience is important. So we want to encourage storytelling and shared experiences. And the reason we want to do this is it helps them share their experiences, listen to each other. It can help healing, and it can also build trust between family members. So, an idea for this would be story circles, or in Indigenous cultures, using a talking circle where each member takes a turn sharing their experience and others just listen. They don't interrupt, they don't try to fix it, don't try to change it, don't deny it. It's just everybody having a say and equal time, and one person speaks at a time. Or you could do it in a way where you use guided questions, where you use prompts that help family members talk about their feelings or their experiences, and prompts to help other people validate. Another strategy for dealing with invalidation in families would be implementing family meetings or check ins. So, these are really important when families become really disconnected, or when they're really busy and don't have a lot of time to kind of come together and do this healing work. So, it might get pushed away or put on pause because there's other things that are busy and going on. But this is a really important way to support and validate each other. So you would do regular family meetings to discuss ongoing issues and check in with each other about their emotional well-being. So ways you can do this would be scheduled check-ins where every a regular time family members come together and they are able to express their feelings or their concerns. And you may want to even set an agenda where you have topics in advance that you ensure all the important issues in the family are addressed. So it might be an upcoming starting school, or it might be an upcoming medical procedure or appointment, so that you can kind of plan in advance for those things. So, our next area we're going to talk about are generational differences in the trauma experience, because these are really important. And when we're dealing with intergenerational trauma, these are definitely going to be in play. So, we need to understand these generational differences, that and what these differences entail in the context of trauma. Um, so, we really need to explicitly discuss this with the families that we're working with. We also want to look at the impact of historical and cultural contexts of different generations of trauma, their experiences, and their coping mechanisms. So if you have a parent that has gone through war, genocide, residential school, any of those large traumas, we need to have an understanding in the younger generations of how that impacts their trauma experiences and their coping mechanisms. So, some of the common differences in trauma experience is the historical context. So, older generations may have experienced a significant historical event. So, wars, economic depressions, 9/11, all of those kinds of big events that shape that individual's trauma. And so, it might be a grandparent who lived through the Great Depression, and they may have trauma related to scarcity or financial insecurity, which is going to impact the rest of the family. That's, I think, where we got in Gen X kids wear bread bags in their shoes so they don't get everything wet and it protects their feet. But that was a very, very useful thing back for people who went through the Great Depression. You want to look at cultural shifts. So, how does society change over time? And how does that influence how trauma is perceived and experienced? So, now with social media, there's a lot of youth and young people who have learned so much about mental health that they're much more open and sharing and self-diagnosing. That really impacts how trauma is perceived. So you may have a situation where, like, a baby boomer really has a stoic approach to trauma. They don't want to talk about it. It's not up for discussion. Everybody just needs to kind of let it go. While millennials and Gen X may seek that emotional expression and mental health support. So those are really important cultural shifts that impact the family in their trauma narratives and how they intersect. Um, So technology influences is also really important. So social media has had a huge impact on generations very differently and how they cope with trauma. Younger generations are probably exposed to a lot more information about mental health, but also all the things that are happening when a trauma or an event or a disaster is unfolding. So that may have a heightened impact on them where they have greater responses to trauma because they're right in the middle of it and they know everything that's going on. And that can be very traumatizing, where older generations may not realize, like, just put your phone down and it won't be an issue, but they can't do that in this younger generation. So the other things younger people may experience is there's so much cyberbullying and social media related stress in general, which older people may not understand that. So that's an important generational difference to be able to talk about. So as therapists, what strategies do we use? So we want to do psychoeducation on generational trauma. We want to educate them about generational trauma and the impact. So an activity may be to do a historical timeline that shows key events that have shaped the different generations in a family. Or you can do cultural context discussions where you look at how societal changes over time impact the trauma expression and perception. So the historical timeline you would want to do in the intergenerational trauma program, that is done much later, when the trauma has been addressed in all generations of the family. So the parents' unresolved trauma is addressed and the child or teen's trauma is addressed, because this can be very traumatizing to do a timeline of different traumas that impacted the generations. So you want to use that one with some caution. And setting up intergenerational dialogue. So they're speaking from their generation's experience and learning to seek understanding between generations. So you want to encourage open conversations that they can share and understand each other's trauma experiences. So you could do this with guided conversations where there's structured questions that they discuss in a group setting or a family therapy setting. In storytelling, you want older family members to tell those family experiences and their stories, and then have younger members listen and ask questions. You might also do it the other way, where the younger person tells their story and the older person or older generation asks questions and listens. So validating diverse experiences and mechanisms, coping mechanisms, is really important because trauma causes us to develop coping mechanisms that just look like quirks or behaviors. But if we understand where those are coming from, they may be less painful for the younger generations or less invalidating. So we help family members recognize and validate their own unique trauma experiences and their coping strategies. We don't want to continue negative or destructive coping strategies, but we want to have that understanding of this was a coping strategy. Maybe heavy drinking was a coping strategy to deal with all this trauma. So it can help build a little bit more connection between family members with less blame and shame. So you could do an empathy exercise where you practice putting family members in each other's shoes so that they can kind of maybe discuss or experience what they think the other person has, and the other person or generation can respond to them. And validation, we want to teach family members to acknowledge and respect different perspectives. It's okay that the family has totally different narratives of the same event. That's a normal thing in trauma. But if they don't realize that that's normal in a traumatic experience, they think the level of invalidation is increased. Another strategy is to bridge the gap using shared activities. So you want to do activities that bring generations together and create that mutual understanding. So it might be a family project to create a family history project where each member contributes to that. Now, that's a nice kind of safe way to start doing some of this family work. So that may be one that I would do before you would ever do a timeline. You can do joint therapy sessions where you have family members work on some type of task together, or some type of coping strategy, or some type of art or play therapy intervention, and you have the generations help each other. So we will also want to look at the technological differences, because older generations may have totally different impacts of technology and social media than what younger generations have. So you could do kind of technology workshops, or identify some technology workshops for the family members, or you could have this happen as a assignment between therapy sessions, where the younger kids teach the older generation about social media, cyberbullying, what they've experienced, in digital stressors. So those are really important for all the generations to understand and learn. But you could have them do a conversation on what they've experienced personally between sessions. And you want to have mixed generation groups. So you want to pair an older person with the younger family members, so that they learn about each other's experiences and the technology and how it's impacting them. So our last area is, how do we promote family resilience through storytelling or narratives regarding the trauma? So first, we need to understand the absolute power of storytelling. So this helps members process the event, and it makes sense of their trauma in the context of the family. So these shared narratives can begin creating a sense of belonging together, even if they have totally different experiences, and understanding within the family. So you may have families share stories about past experiences and build that cohesive family history. With intergenerational trauma, what we really want to do is we want to harness the resilience of previous generations. So if you had somebody many generations ago that was an advocate that fought really hard for something that's important to the family today, you want to build that into that story, so that those previous generations' resilience help build that family resilience in the current family unit. So, the benefits of storytelling and acknowledgement of other people's experiences include emotional processing. So, it allows people to express their feelings and their experiences, helps them emotionally process it. So, it may transform, or they may have less reactivity to it. They have been heard and seen and understood. So, it might be a mother sharing her story of how she overcame abuse experience in childhood, and helping her daughter understand her emotional reactions when she is upset or triggered by that previous abuse. Building empathy and understanding or compassion between family members is critical. So, hearing each other's stories fosters that connection, fosters compassion and understanding among the family members. So, an example of this would be siblings that share their perspectives on a traumatic event that they both experienced. They may be able to support each other better and have reduced conflict, because they realize we're in this together and everybody had some kind of impact. Although it may look very different, may look like one person got away without a lot of impacts, may look like one person is carrying all the impacts, but they're in this together. And that's an important use of that narrative or storytelling in the family. And creating that shared family narrative, this is how we transform that trauma into family resilience. So you want a narrative that acknowledges each family member's experiences, their strengths, developing a family identity, and one that's based on resilience. So it might be for a family who's had to has been displaced, it may be their migration journey, and recognizing the struggles of that, but also the achievements of each generation, and how it may be migration much earlier than the current generations, but learning to integrate that and put that understanding and compassion for previous generations and current generations in with how the achievements, the accomplishments, the resilience, even if it looks like it's kind of being difficult or standing up for themselves, you want those in there because that's how this family survived. So, strategies for therapists with facilitating storytelling sessions. We want to guide families in sharing their stories. We have to create that safe, supportive environment. So, it might be those storytelling circles where each family member takes that turn. There's no interruptions. There's no one person that's dominating, so that each person has their share or their time to express what they've experienced. And then you might want to use guided questions to help family members articulate their stories or to help kind of structure the discussion. You can do acknowledgement exercises, which teaches people how to acknowledge and validate other people's experiences and feelings. So you want to use validation statements, and you may need to teach these right out. So these are phrases that affirm and acknowledge or validate another person's experience. So I hear that you felt XYZ. I understand that that was very difficult for you. Not trying to change it, not trying to make it look different, not trying to rationalize it or get it to go away. It's just, I hear you. I understand that must have been difficult for you. You can also teach reflective listening, where you paraphrase and reflect back what the other person has shared to show that you understood it and you got what they've experienced. Creating a family resilience narrative is really important. So it helps them build a connective narrative or understanding of the trauma and the family, and it includes each member's experiences and highlights the family's resilience. So ways that you can do this is, again, a timeline creation, but you create this with the significant events and experiences of each member and include the resilience in there or things that help pull them forward. And you may want to include many generations past as well. Resilience mapping. So this is something that we do in phase 3 of the intergenerational trauma program, is we resilience map the family. So we identify and map out instances of resilience and strength within that family's history. And we also look at different things that are related, different areas that are related to family resilience, like communication, if they have people of faith, what that faith is and how it builds the resilience in the family. So these different domains in life that help support family resilience, we map that out and get it kind of physically on something that they can understand where that resilience is coming from and how they can harness that currently in their family. Art and creative expression is wonderful for this. So you may want to include it into storytelling so it's a visual and it conveys an experience differently so that they can see it on the paper. So you may have them create a family mural that represents their journey and experiences. You could have them do individual art projects and encourage each family member to complete their art that expresses and represents their personal story. So that is a lot of information about how these trauma narratives intersect and impact each other. And it's really important for us to have this knowledge because these intersections can either create resilience or they can create huge divides in families as well. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next week where we continue to talk about supporting complex families. Have a great day.